I hope everyone has had a good New Year's celebration. I don't know how you celebrated. It was kind of quiet over at our house. I was still exhausted from Christmas, I guess, but we had a traditional meal, or more or less. I don't think we had any turnip greens, but I had some green beans. I heard a lot of talk on the internet of people encouraging everybody to eat their peas. So we'd have a better year this year. I'm sure that'll make the biggest difference. I'm glad that you're here this morning. Again, we appreciate you letting us know if you can hear or see. I think we've worked out some of the kinks of problems. They were all from my inattentions or lack of observation. But we are back in our second lockdown now, and our on-site services have been suspended. Been attending a lot of funerals lately, and had a dear friend that passed away this weekend, Miss Natalie Watson Fogg. I had not seen a Natalie in a long time, but her memorial service will be tomorrow. It was my pleasure to have been Natalie's pastor at the Oak Park Baptist Church, and grew to love she and her husband, Van Watson, one of my special people there. Van would stand out at the corner of our property and greet people as they drove into our parking lot. He did that for a number of years. It was my honor to speak at his memorial service. A great sadness and loss to our church. He was one of those deacons and one of those kinds of men that impossible to replace. And Natalie, of course, a sweet spirit. Later, when I became a member and pastor at the Concord Baptist Church, it was many years later that Natalie had moved out into the Limestone County area where she was from, and had remarried a fine gentleman there named Bruce Fogg. Fogg family is in our church and in our community. Bruce was a fine fellow, had his own business there, and at Route 2 Tony, or nearabouts. She and Bruce had remarried, and so I got to be Natalie's pastor again. And had not seen her in her sister, Joe Bishop, was also a member at Oak Park, and those sisters are together now. And I regret I will not be able to be at her memorial service, but I've had fond memories of her and being her pastor and serving and working with her for many years. Other people are sick, have been sick, and have had difficulties. I believe I've scheduled for us to go over our prayer list in the morning worship hour at 11, so I'll do that later. But I did receive a text message just a few minutes ago from Edna Whitman. I spoke with Edna earlier this week, and she had just the day before been in the emergency room. She's been struggling with COVID-19 and all of its symptoms and worries. But she said that she's feeling better today than she has in a long time. So I think she had about 16 or 17 days she battled with this. So pray for Edna Whitman. But our services, we're also, if you know someone who would like to be a part of our services and study along with us or worship with us, maybe they don't have a Facebook account, I always post this on our church website and on our web page. You can go to our home page, and there's a tab that just says, up at the top says videos, and our Sunday school lesson and the Sunday morning message is there. I know that there are a number of our church members who do not partake in social media or have a smartphone or internet service at all. And so we want to continue to do everything we can to stay in touch with them and to make sure that everybody knows that no one is forgotten. We're in the fifth lesson today in the Gospel of Luke. The quarterly, there are, as I mentioned, there are a few quarterlies still available. If you didn't get one, let me know. But today is January the 3rd, the very first Sunday of the year 2021. Danny had mentioned earlier that that kind of sounds very futuristic. Who would have thought that we would be about and that we would live in the time of the 2020s? Well, we are in the 2021, and 2020 has been marked as a very difficult, very hard year. We lost loved ones. We also heard great news of new births that are on the way. Some we had in our own family this year. Part of the joy that I had and that we had together was we had two little baby girls that were the center of attention. And I watched my own two little granddaughters, and they didn't seem to feel too badly at all that they were no longer the center of everybody's attention. But they were happy to play with their two new little cousins, so that they're doing all right. People are worried. I guess they have a sister who's on the way as well, but everything looks like I don't have any concerns about them at all. We're going to be looking at a story that only Luke shares with us. As I wonder about this, I don't know where Luke got this information, but it's the only scriptural information we have, the only scriptural story we have about the time in Jesus' life between his birth, his infancy, and his beginning ministry. We see Jesus at the baptism when he was baptized by John the Baptist. Luke puts this little passage here about a time when Jesus was taken to Jerusalem by Joseph and Mary. It seems that we already know and feel that we know Joseph and Mary. And even though we know so very little about them, they are very much in character from what we have already learned from the Scriptures. This is an artist's rendition that I found that I had never seen before. And let me show you something. I was determined I was going to do this. This is one thing that I do as a part of, it's a part in, I guess in recent years has become a part of my sermon preparation and a part of my devotion as well. I know all of the problems there is with using Google, but if you use the Google search engine, you can go, if you look here on the upper right hand corner, it just says images. This is something I do for, that helps my imagination. I like images. I like representations. I guess it offends many people. They probably think of them as graven images, or certainly just maybe not the correct or proper ethnicity. But sometimes artists go to great lengths to portray historical settings. I would go to Google and then click on images, and I would type in 12-year-old Jesus. And there's lots of different ways you might approach that, and anything that you're studying. If you know just enough to form a phrase or to use a word, and just tell Google to look for images. And so here is a collection of what many people thought that might have looked like. I look for scenes or images that I had never seen before. Several weeks ago I shared with you a story about our family Bible and the picture on the front. This picture right here is that picture. If you click on one of those, it kind of sets it off to the side. And then you can go over here to these arrows. that picture doesn't have a hole in it. But anyway, just to look here and to kind of arrow through. There's, of course, Jesus, not 12 years of age there, but his mama's come and get him and saying, hey, we've been looking for you. We got to go. That's what the story's about. Then we're going to do a little bit of study. But this is to see what this person, of course, there's something very interesting about this. Can you see that? There's a blind man right here. You know that Jesus healed a blind man in the temple in his ministry? And I wonder if that painter thought, well, that guy didn't just show up that day. It said he'd been born blind. Jesus had seen that man his whole life. Walked right past him. Maybe even spoken to him as a child. Because the Bible says, here in Luke, that Jesus' parents took him to Jerusalem regularly. And so we have these images. Jesus looks like he's got a 20th century haircut right there. It's kind of feathered. I don't know why it has a little gray in it, but that's the one I chose. Now that is an image of Jesus where he looks very Middle Eastern. And he has a headdress on. And the costumes look a little more authentic. And so Jesus may very well have looked something. You'll find that little boy right there, you could find him all over the streets of Israel today. The Jews and the Arabs look very much like that. Hardly like that. Hardly like that. Blonde-haired and blue-eyed Jesus. But I don't think that represents a prejudice or a bias so much as it sometimes when we paint things or draw things or we say things, I really do think that the people that you and I meet, every single one of us live in an entirely different world. We see things through different eyes. Your experiences and the environment that you grew up in, the people that you knew, it means that our realities might be completely different. And that's why we need to be very understanding and patient with each other. There may be something that you and I look at and we just think is just wonderful, and another person says, well, no, that's not wonderful at all. This little Jesus kind of reminds me of that 6th grade picture of my mother. It looks a little bit sad and kind of wore out, but he still kind of looks very 20th century. And there's Simeon and Hannah. In all of these, the reason I chose the one that I did is because it didn't show Jesus kind of standing in the middle of everybody like this. I don't think this was a situation where he was teaching them, but they were amazed with his wisdom and his knowledge. This little one has a halo around his head. That would have been impressive. Hey, look at there. He's got a halo. So, all of this needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But look at it. There's no doubt, and his mama's coming there to wear him out. So, there's his mom again. Said, hey, I'm just saying these. There again, I think that is the same, from the same media. I don't know these images, but looks like a very Middle Eastern family. Probably more historically correct. Let mom ride the donkey and we'll walk along. And they were headed into Jerusalem. It was a long walk. Of course, there's some you have to kind of filter through. It looks like all of them were wise men who came there to the temple. But anyway, a lot of head dressing. Now this one, Jesus is holding a scroll in his lap. Very likely, but a possibility. Because in the synagogues, now he was in the temple here, but unlikely that they let children hold the scrolls, but here's Jesus knew the Scriptures, and so we don't know. I would have to say I'm ignorant of that. Here he's sitting in the middle of them, looks like he's smarter than they are, and I don't think that that was the impression at all. Sitting on the steps, very casual, maybe not in the enclosure of the temple. But these are kind of things to look at, because it's like a teacher or a preacher or someone sharing their point of view or the way they see it or the way they imagine it, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is from the miniseries by Franco Zeffirelli called Jesus of Nazareth, and a very striking blue-eyed little boy. But unlikely that Jesus looked anything at all like that, and yet I'm always interested when I'm sitting down with someone. What do you think about this? How do you think that this was? And I do see, just from looking at those artists, that people have different ways of imagining things. They see things in different ways. That doesn't change reality, but the fact of the matter is that the only reality we know, the only facts we know are here in the Scriptures. So we're looking at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verse 41. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And I'm reading from the New International Version. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival. We understand, the King James Version calls these, and rightly so, and they were in the Old Testament called feasts. But when we, I wonder how much this has influenced the way Baptists worship, is that we think that fellowship is spelled the same as casserole. And we think of our time together in terms of food. It was called a feast, and it almost always did involve some kind of meal. But there was the Feast of Weeks, and where they didn't eat hardly anything, especially unleavened. They ate a lot of unleavened bread. But a festival is a modern word. We know what a festival is. It's based upon the word feast. But a festival is like a celebration. And so it was a time of religious observance, but it was cast in great celebration and joy. So the Passover, the Passover feast, might give the indication that it was all about the food, when really it was not. The Passover Seder meal was just a very small part of Passover. But it's important to understand that as this young mother and father and their 12-year-old boy come into town, think of festival. That's very good. It is not meaning that any of the other translations were incorrect, but our words change in modern times, and we give different meanings to different words. To think of them coming into town thinking about, oh, there's going to be lots of good things to eat, it's a feast. Or there's going to be a lot of commotion, there's going to be a lot of traffic, many people, it's a festival. And according to the custom, after the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. There's no casting by Luke at all that this was any kind of disobedience, or that Jesus was being unruly, or that he was lacking in submissiveness. He's just saying that Jesus just stayed behind. We might be critical of Mary and Joseph and say, they just left town. I think if we understood the circumstances under which they arrived and how they, what the circumstances of their participation was, probably almost everybody who could walk or travel from this little town of Nazareth was a part of their entourage or their caravan, and they came together. And the little boys and girls were running about. They didn't stay there and hold to Mama's hand. I imagine that Jesus would disappear after they rose and started on their journey, and there'd be lots of rock throwing and rock climbing and hide and seek, chase and tag and run about, and they probably wouldn't even see Jesus again until it was dark and they had started the fire, and they probably had communal fires where it wasn't just everybody had their own fireplace. They had several big fires that people get around it, and they shared their food and shared what they'd brought with them. In that sense, it was feasting. It was a very simple fare, but the kids would come back only because they'd been instructed to come back as soon as it got dark or when it was time to eat. So there's nothing awry about this as a possibility. You can be standing right beside children or be very, I think today we are very, very protective of our children, and I'm happy. Sometimes I know that my daughter and son-in-law, I'll ask them and say, are you watching the kids? Or where are the kids? Danny and I, growing up, our parents didn't know where we were or what we were doing. They didn't say, what'd you do today? We didn't sit around the table saying, what did you do with your day today? Do that. My parents didn't want to know what I'd been doing. We'd been finding crab apples and seeing if we could find grapevines. People had gardens. We went around to different places where we feasted ourselves all day long, but we ran through the cotton fields. We climbed through the trees and swung on vines in the holler. And but we were supposed to show up around supper time. So our parents, I think parents today are perhaps too obsessive. We want to make sure that they have plenty of hand sanitization and a mask, and of course that's all very good. And as I said, I'm always prompting Chris and Brian to be more watchful. Just to let the kids go out on their bicycles and go out into the community without any supervision seems odd to us. But they used to just throw us in the back seat with no seat belts. We'd drive for many, many miles laying in the floorboard or up in the back window of the car. If you were ever in an accident, you'd just be like a projectile. We traveled around in the back of the bed of a pickup truck. I would just have an emotional fit if I saw my kids riding around in the back. It scares me to death to watch my father-in-law drive the kids around on the four-wheeler. Different times. All of that, most of that is unwarranted. They began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. Well, almost anything could have happened. It was not as common in those days for someone to harm a child, or there was no reason to kidnap a child. I remember when we were in just beginning, I believe in the 7th grade, was the very first time that I was ever required to read short stories, and we read The Ransom of Red Chief. One of the science fiction stories that I kept up with for a while was about it was on a story that came on every Friday night, and there was a little girl who was born with very special powers as part of this fictional story, and she was very, very powerful, and she was a little mischievous, and she was hard to handle and difficult, and so in order to punish her mother and father or to get leverage on them, they came and kidnapped her. And I recognized it immediately. I said, this is the Ransom of Red Chief. Have you ever read that story? It was made into a wonderful little movie many, many years ago. But there was this little boy. He was a Dennis the Menace kind of little kid. He was just rambunctious. I wouldn't want to say he was mean, but he was just, and these kidnappers were going to ransom him. And he was called Red Chief because he dressed up like an Indian, like a Native American warrior. And he pulled their hair out and tied them up and almost burned them at the stake. And finally, they sent a note back to the parents and said, we're going to bring your son back. And they said, well, if you're going to bring him back, we'll need you to bring at least $100. So they had to raise up some money to pay the parents to take him back. So Jesus was not that kind of child, but these days there is such a thing as children being kidnapped or spirited away or sold into slavery. That was probably not a thought in Mary and Joseph's mind. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. That's why I don't prefer the artist's drawings or paintings where it looks like the 12-year-old Jesus is explaining things to them. I believe here it says that he was, and let me tell you this, it is very impressive to know what questions to ask. He was listening to them and asking questions. Sometimes, there's a lot of sources by which I try to bring in information into my mind and my heart using the computer these days. And I guess the most disturbing thing is that there are so many people, men and women, teachers and preachers and pastors and spiritual leaders, so many of them who have the answer to every question. They know about everything. Now, if you compare one to another, their answers are different. Their observations are different. Their solutions are different. But I guess maybe that's my voice, and I don't have a worldwide or an international voice. But somebody out there needs to be on the internet or television saying, we don't know. We don't know the answer to this. What we have today is people with greater imagination and are better at speculation. But I don't believe that there's an answer to everything, and I believe that many times they're just using the wisdom of men to provide answers when often people should be told the truth. Nobody knows. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this?" They didn't treat him anyway, but that's the way mothers think. "Your father and I have anxiously searched for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house?" Now, there are many textual variations about Jesus' response. That means of the different copies of Luke's gospel. There are some copies that say, "I had to be about my Father's house," and others say, "I had to be about my Father's business." So, if you have a modern translation, various ones will say, and sometimes they'll just put a footnote and say that this may possibly be about my Father's business, be about my Father's house. It's an avenue. It's no reason for distress, but we have many, many copies of New Testament documents. No two of them are identical. So there are variant readings. Some choose today to say, well, we need to pick one and say that's the perfect one. But the thing is that as long as men have to do with translating and interpreting, with our faults and our flaws will always be a part of the mix. That's why it's very important, as I preach and I teach, for you to know that only God can let you know what the truth is. And as you interact with Him and His Spirit, we have the Word of God, but we're always studying and trying to learn the possibilities. The point is that Jesus was 12 years of age, and they still had memories and wonderment about the circumstances surrounding his birth. But Matthew and Luke both tell us that after that, Jesus just kind of became an ordinary, or for all practical purposes, Mary and Joseph didn't want that Christmas night kind of life. They wanted things to get back to normal, and they wanted very much for Jesus just to be an ordinary or a normal child. He never was, he never would be. There's a question that we discussed when I was in seminary that I had never been aware of, that spoke about Jesus' messianic consciousness. Was Jesus so peculiar and unusual and unique as a little bitty baby that he had a halo, or that did he start speaking when he was 2 days old? Could he walk when he was only a month old? Or was he a normal child? And in that regard, as a human being, did Jesus have to go through the process of coming to a realization of who he was? Or did he always know? Was he always aware of his divinity and of his deity? But was Jesus so strange and peculiar? We don't know. That's one of those things we'd have to say, we don't know. We don't know when Jesus became conscious of his mission and of who he was. But we know here that Jesus knew that, Mary said this is very important. Your father and I have been searching for you. Jesus picked up on that word. I've been at my Father's house. Been doing my Father's business. Now, I don't think there's any question or any doubt that he loved Joseph and that he was obedient to Joseph. He was submissive to Joseph. I found just before Christmas a painting that I'd never seen before, and it was a young Jesus, not 12, but maybe in his mid or late 20s, at the bedside of his ailing earthly father, as Joseph was perhaps dying of some illness, and Jesus was with him as possible. The Bible doesn't say anything at all about what became of Joseph or why he was absent in the story of Jesus' adulthood. But he knew that at 12 years of age that God was his father, and that he had a mission that was beyond being a little boy, that was beyond, and his question is not chiding, but and this, of course, hindsight is 20/20, and we have much more information about Jesus than even Mary and Joseph did. But if I imagine myself to be in the entourage there, and Mary and Joseph came running up to our family as we were traveling toward Nazareth, I'd say, what's wrong? We can't find Jesus. He's not anywhere in our midst. And they would say, we think he might be in Jerusalem. And I would say, I think I think that's probably so. If he's not here, then the last place you saw him is a good place to look. Now, then they would say, and maybe they wouldn't, but they might say, I'm certainly a lot older than they were. They looked at me as an old, wise person traveling in the group, hardly able to make the trip, maybe my last one. Where do you think we ought to start? And I'd say, why? I wouldn't look but in one place. I can't think of any place I'd look other than the temple. I'd go to the temple. If he wasn't there, I'd look around at the surrounding synagogues in the area. There's no doubt a dozen synagogues around throughout Jerusalem. Jesus, I know enough about Jesus myself that I think that's where I'd start looking. I wouldn't let that be the place I looked for him after 3 days. But that's just me, and that's, again, I'd have to say, I don't know. I don't know where I'd look for him, but let me just suggest he might be in the temple. He might be in the temple. I don't know who fed him those 3 days, or where he slept, or what he thought had happened, but evidently when they found him, he wasn't all that worried. Many years ago, I was the youth director at the Show Creek Baptist Church, and Brother C.G. Redding we had a revival in our church, and Brother Redding invited Brother Fred Lackey, the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Athens, and I'm not even sure that that's where Brother Fred was serving at that time, but he served for many years as the pastor of First Baptist Church of Athens. He served as the chancellor of one of our Alabama Christian universities as well, and other places of great note. He was a great preacher, and I was glad to serve with him there in Limestone Baptist Association. But Brother Fred, I'll never forget this. He came and preached a revival in our church at the Shoal Creek Baptist Church, and I remember that he started that revival by preaching a sermon that was entitled, Losing Jesus. Losing Jesus. And it was the most unusual sermon I had ever heard. And I was familiar with this story because it was about this passage. And he says, I'm not talking about losing your salvation or somehow another losing your relationship with Jesus. But he says, I'm just talking about just exactly, you see, Jesus was still their son. They were still his parents. The relationship was still there. The fellowship was still there. But they hadn't, without question and without doubt, lost Jesus. And Brother Fred very skillfully talked about how sometimes we go on about our way, or we forget, or we become unfocused. As Christians, sometimes we become so wrapped up in what we're thinking about that we forget about Jesus. And so he was using this in a spiritual sense to say that they lost Jesus. They left him behind. And it was a wonderful sermon, and I will never forget it. I've preached it a few times myself. During Christmas celebration in the beginning of a new year, it's very possible that sometimes we might lose the elements of our walk with Christ that are very important. And it's almost as if, and he's always there, and he's always within us. And so there's actually no actual separation. But we might get distracted and lose our focus. We might be thinking about things that are not important, or not as important as our walk with him. It's something to think about. Then he went down, well, verse 50 says, they didn't understand what he was saying to them. Again, on that point, I don't think Mary or Joseph ever completely understood everything about Jesus, even though that Mary followed him all the days of her life and as a devoted disciple. I believe that she was the first Christian, the first person to believe in Jesus. And yet we find from her questions and her interaction with him throughout his life and ministry that even Mary, it says she just pondered those things in her heart. It's just a mystery to her. If you ask Mary about what all Jesus was about, I don't think anyone can truly, fully. If you think one day when you get to heaven and you're in your glorified body and you have your glorified mind and you're there with Jesus, and you might, as we sing in the song Amazing Grace, after you've been there 10,000 years, you think you understand Jesus? I would differ with you. I would think that we might know so much more about him when we spend that time with him. But I think he's so far beyond us. Greater, grander, more majestic, more beyond our comprehension, that even in our glorified state, to imagine that we know everything about him or that we understand, I think would be a mistake. And to be honest with you, I do not frown or fret about that. That is not something that causes me anxiety or consternation. I love having a God who is so great. And he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. It's not an implication there that from that point on he was obedient. Well, he was obedient always, but his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Well, that's a wonderful story, and I'm so grateful that Luke is the kind of person who says, this is a story that needs to be told. This is something that only He tells us about. It gives us an insight. What did Jesus know, and when did He know it? Well, He was already about His Father's business. And I believe the first place to look for Him is still always going to be the house of God. And yet many people today find Him, and especially today when the house of God might be suspending their services, Jesus is findable. Because He says, as we studied in Isaiah, I was found of those who sought me not. Well, a wonderful story, and there's great truth there. But as we look and see, there's still a great deal about Jesus that I don't understand. And that's all right. That's all right. Danny sings a song. I can't remember the name of the song right now. It says, everything's not okay, but that's okay. And I don't understand everything, but that's all right too. Everything is not as I wish it was, but that's all right. That's okay. So I think that's a mark of maturity. To count on everything being just right is just a Goldilocks kind of philosophy or theology. And it has nothing to do with trusting God or believing God and living the life that He has given us. And no matter what happens, not living under the circumstances, but above and beyond the circumstances. Wonderful story. God bless you. Join us at 11. Take a break, maybe drink a cup of coffee, stir the pot that's on the stove for lunch or dinner, and if you can, join us then. God bless you all.